Well, we're continuing in 1 Peter 3 today. Let me click over there. And again, Peter's writing to a persecuted congregation. I mean, he says, you're strangers, you're sojourners, you're not where you want to be. But the Lord knows where you are. You're not outside of his understanding. He knew you'd be here. He chose you for this. And we're actually told, and we're told again today, it's to this, you were called to this. And that word for calling has to do with the summons, with an invitation. And we saw a couple days ago, I believe it was on Thursday when we were looking at the back end of 1 Peter chapter 2, that we were invited to follow in his footsteps. We were invited to discipleship. And discipleship isn't, in our thinking often, discipleship is somehow just what we're doing here, right? A Bible study, going through the Word. But it's to walk with him. It's to follow him. It's not to just, it's not simply, even today, this isn't a discipleship that's intended to simply feed our intellect. But it's intended for us to allow the Word of God to pierce us in our depths, in the depths of our being, in the midst of our circumstances, and to transform us into his likeness. That what Yeshua invited his disciples to do was to follow him. And he said, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. And it's the same language that's used as is used in 1 Peter chapter 2, when he says we're to follow in his footsteps. It's to this you were invited. So he's reminding them, you were born, you're made new. You were born again, you were born into a living hope. And what you're going through, the sufferings, the trials that you're facing, are purification. They're purifying your faith. They're preparing you. They're making you. The persecution can actually bring a clarity to the mission that God has called you to. Your mission is right. He says that you are a house of living stones, a family of living stones, and that you're a chosen generation. You're a kingdom of priests. You're a set-apart people unto God, a holy nation, chosen as God's own possession. You've not been forgotten, so that you can show forth or proclaim, make known the excellencies, the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his light. So with that in mind, he says, here's what we got to do, guys. You got to hold away from you the cravings of your flesh. And when you're in a persecuted situation, when you're being mistreated, when you're being treated unjustly, when you're dealing with loss that is, again, what happens when the natural response to injustice, the natural response to being treated unjustly and wrongly is an internal, we use the word, when we go to talk about it, like indignation, but a fury within. And the desire is to retaliate, to defend yourself. And so what he draws us to is to the example of Yeshua as to how we're to operate in a world in which we are outsiders, in a world in which we are mistreated, in a world in which we are, he says, and by the way, if you're being mistreated, the people that are facing imprisonment for storming storming the Capitol are not being persecuted unjustly for their faith, right? They're being persecuted because, or they're facing prosecution because of what they did. He said, look, if you face discipline for doing evil, that's really not that's nothing to really brag about there. He says, but when you suffer unjustly, when you suffer because of righteousness, you can rejoice. And he's going to reiterate that further along in chapter 3. So he acknowledges their persecution, and he acknowledges that it's often unjust. They haven't done anything to deserve it. But he's basically saying, look, violent opposition is not what you were called to. That wasn't the invitation to rise up. That wasn't, the Messiah didn't come say, let's go overthrow the kingdoms of this world violently. That wasn't the path that he invited us on. Violent resistance actually betrays the instructions of Yeshua. It goes counter to not just his words, but to his example. He said he didn't just talk about what the kingdom of God looked like, he demonstrated it. And then he says, now you've seen me do this, you do the same. Follow me. Follow me, follow in my footsteps. And it's easy to do on paper. It's hard to do when the persecution's real. It's hard to do for these believers who have been ripped away from everything that they've ever had. It's in those moments, we've talked about this, where what's inside of you, in pressure moments, what's inside comes out. When you're squeezed, what's actually in you is revealed. What's actually in me is revealed. How do I respond? What's alarming to me about me are the things that I think and feel when I'm unjustly treated, or when I feel like I'm unfairly accused. Because my natural inclinations are anger and to strike back and to retaliate. By my nature, and I know not everyone is naturally, we're all fighters in different way. By my nature, I'm a fighter. And everything in me wants to rise up, to defend self, to defend myself when I'm treated or mischaracterized, treated unjustly. And so what I see is, in moments of those kinds of pressure, what's squeezed out of me says, Lord, you've got a lot more work to do in the transformation of the inner man here. That I die daily because the cravings, the desire for retaliation. So when he says, hold away, stay away from the cravings of your flesh, it's not simply talking about sort of sensual cravings. It's talking about when you're being mistreated, what you hunger for is retaliation. And it says, you know what? When Yeshua suffered, when they hurled their insults at him, he didn't retaliate. When he suffered abuse, he didn't respond in kind. He didn't do the same thing back. Instead, here's what he did. He gave it to the one who judges in righteousness and justice. He entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. So in those moments, when Yeshua was suffering, when his beard was being yanked, when he was being spit at, when he was being mocked, the King of the universe, right, the one by whom all things were made, was being mocked by his creation. And what came forth when squeezed, what came out of him, because it's who he is, it's who he was, it's who he always will be, what came out of him was, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. So he's saying that's our model. If you're looking for the template, this is the example. It uses kind of a word based on the word grammar, as he is our model. He is the outline for how we're supposed to live in that moment. And so it's easy for us to, or it's not even easy, but it's easy for us somehow to walk like Yeshua when things are easy. But when push comes to shove, we say, well, hold on now, this is the real world. Well, hold on just a second. You can't just... And that's where we have to look to him and say, all right, what does it mean to walk as Yeshua walked? What was Peter telling his followers as Peter's writing to them? These people he's saying, I'm writing to you as sojourners. What are you going to do? And we looked on Friday, or on Thursday and Friday, he starts he says, look, you guys got to submit to, you're in the midst of Roman rule. I get it. You're in the midst of pagan rule. He's writing, we find out at the end of the letter, he's writing from Rome. He knows. He's writing from Rome, and he's saying you got to submit to Roman rule, even if it's oppressive. He acknowledges again that their suffering is unjust. But now he says, here's the thing, those, as an example, he goes to those who are in the most vulnerable positions. He talks to slaves and to wives and what they faced when they lived in households where the patriarch of the household was not one who followed Yeshua. The problem is that it was expected that those in the household, in the Roman world, those in the household, slaves, wives, everyone was expected to submit to the gods of the patriarch, of the man of the house. And so Peter is aware that if for these slaves and for wives who have given their lives to the Lord, that submission to Yeshua, allegiance to Yeshua could be viewed with hostility in their homes. So he affirms to them, look, you're all free. You are free. You've been liberated, including slaves and wives. You've been liberated, but you're to demonstrate your freedom not through rebellion, but by resisting evil, by holding at a distance the cravings of your flesh, the same way Yeshua did, right? You love your enemies. And in the homes, so they're to resist in a different way. They're to submit, and even when they're mistreated, to love as Yeshua loved. In the homes where the husband is a believer, they are to treat their wives. By the way, and we talked about this in more detail on Friday, so that it doesn't leave room for what's happened often is that believing husbands use this stuff as a justification for mistreating their wives, and they think they have biblical justification. When the Lord is telling these folks who are supposed to be winning the lost, if your husbands they don't know the Lord, this is the way you can win them to the Lord. The expectation is that believing husbands are not going to be operating in that way, not going to be operating like the Romans and bringing in abuse. And in fact, he goes on to say to the husbands who are believers, live with your wives in a way that is an understanding way, to know them. They're actually they're to treat them as they would something precious and valuable. And it says, paying them the honor that is due as co-heirs, as equals before God. That this is mind-blowing. This is absolutely transformational. That the believing husbands are to operate quite differently than their Roman counterparts in elevating their wives to a place of equality. And so Peter is hopeful that the imitation of Yeshua's love and of kind of this upside-down kingdom will give power to their words as they bear witness to Yeshua, as they show forth they demonstrate his way. And so he now comes and says in verse 8, says, finally, which is to de telos, which is, and now to the goal, to the conclusion, so it can be finally, to the end. And now the end, and now the conclusion, or now the goal. Here's the deal, all of you. It says, be harmonious, homophrones, which is one mind. Be of one mind. Be of the same mind. Be sympathetic, sympathés, which is to suffer with. It literally means to suffer with. To be sympathetic or compassionate, understanding. Brotherly love, express brotherly love, Philadelphia, family love, the love of family. Be tenderhearted, which is the goodness of your inner parts, your bowels, but from the depth of you, let there be goodness, tenderhearted. And then humble-minded, lowly, humble of mind, of heart. So the believing community is to be this society where believers, like within, shouldn't be facing the same insults and persecution from without. You're supposed to be of one mind. And so, the question, some commentators are like, is he talking about how they're supposed to treat one another, or how they're supposed to be toward the outsiders? And everything up until now has been about how we are to behave with outsiders in mind. Everything has been written in terms of recognizing you're in a hostile society. How are you to live in that? And it's a countercultural situation. But he's saying, be of one mind. Be single-minded. Be in harmonious. Now, he's not saying be in harmony now with the outside world, with the Roman world. The Roman world really actually exalted sort of like-mindedness because they felt like it made a society strong. That's why things that would, like Messianic faith, like faith in Yeshua, could be subversive to the Roman way because it was a different way. But he's saying you've been born again, born into a new family. He's saying as newborn babies, grow up into your salvation by craving the purity of the Logos, of the Word, of the reality of who Yeshua is. And now we're supposed to be characterized by these qualities, by a like-mindedness, and then a sympathy. That sympathy, suffering with, it has to do with getting outside of yourself, right? It's outside of, a lot of times people are like, well, if I'm not hurting, I'm fine. But he's actually calling us to suffer alongside and to enter into the suffering of others. Brotherly love, or Philadelphoi, which has to do with love like family love, sibling love. There's a purity to that. And then there's the quality of being tenderhearted, right? Compassionate, healthy entrails is good, like in the depth of you. Like I said, it's our idiom now is heart, has to do with your heart, not your bowels, But it's a tenderhearted, good-hearted toward one another. And then finally, the quality of humility. This is the most countercultural thing, in particular, that's listed here. Humble-minded would have been most out of place in the Roman world. Modesty or moderation might be regarded as good, but to be humble-minded, to be lowly of mind, was regarded as a sign of shame, of weakness. You need to defend your honor, not let yourself be insulted. And I want to read someone, one of the scholars wrote this. He says, in a deft restructuring of the way the world works, Peter takes a label that might well have been used by unbelievers in a smear campaign against followers of Messiah and uses it positively as characteristic disposition of believers. He can do this only because of a long record of extolling the virtue of humility in Israel's scriptures, including the tradition concerning the humble as the object of divine favor, and the example of Yeshua presented by Peter already as exemplary. So he's saying what everyone would have said, what would have been the insult. These people are, look at them, marginalized, low-minded, humble-minded people, can't defend themselves, would have been a smear campaign against believers. He takes the very thing that they would have insulted us with and says, boy, that's just like Yeshua. And he lifts it up. He lifts it up and says, this is who we're to be like. This is who we're to walk like. What we've got today, again, I can't speak for the rest of the world, but what we often have is an Americanized version of Yeshua, right? The American way is not one of being humble-minded. It's not one of laying down your rights. It's not one that is has generally been concerned about the poor and the weak, although our Statue of Liberty invites them to come, but it's all about pull yourself up, be independent. Our founders, it was a rebellion. You know what I mean? It was not about submission, it was about rebellion. And so that's very much in the fabric of our society, but I think it's also in the fabric of human nature. I tend to think that's in the fabric of our broken human nature. And so the way of what we've often done is wrapped up Yeshua, reframed him in a way that would almost make him a good American. When the goal is not to make Yeshua into a good American, but it's to make Americans, to make us, and we're strangers, right? Sojourners. This is not where my allegiance ultimately is, but it's to him and to his kingdom. And in the midst of this place that I walk out as he walked, submitted to the laws, and submitted to being submissive, walking in his way, but to be transformative in the place where he's put us. To be transformative right here, not to rise up in rebellion, but to show forth his love, to be single-minded with him, to be unified, like-minded with him, to be compassionate, right? To be tender-hearted, to love one another, and to be lowly in mind, to be humble-minded, to walk in humility, not rising up to defend ourselves. And again, what we keep pursuing is to rise up to places of power, so that we have equal say and influence, so we can exert power. But he didn't do that. He didn't exalt himself. Instead, he humbled himself, Philippians 2 says, taking on the very nature of the servant. Right? Not considering equality with God something to be grasped. He emptied himself. And that's what he's invited us to. So all of these terms that we're invited to are all about intimacy, closeness, and they're all oriented toward concern for others, right? Be harmonious, of one mind, be sympathetic, be brotherly love, tender-hearted, humble-minded. They all have to do with an orientation that puts others ahead of self, which is counterintuitive, which goes against my very nature. And they're not strategic behaviors. They're not like, okay, do these things. They're supposed to be characteristics that are part of us. They're supposed to be part of my character, of who I'm becoming. That's the goal, is to become like him, not to act like him, but to become like him. Sometimes we act like him when we're not like him, just so that we can become more like him, right? So sometimes we're walking out in obedience, that which has not been formed into the depth of our being. Like children who don't understand why they're being told what to do, but because they're obedient, they're doing what they've been told to do. And the desire is that behavior and that following of their parents will form in them. They'll become like their parents. And those qualities and those values that their parents have taught them will be within them. And so he now says, don't worry, even though we're going through verse 12, and I've just done one verse, it's not that much longer. It says, do not repay, don't give back evil for evil, or insult for insult. And this has to be, the word here has to do more with like verbal abuse. So it's a word for abuse, but it's don't give back verbal abuse for verbal abuse, insult for insult. But instead, or in the place of it, opposite, give a blessing. Give a good word. When they insult you, don't give them back an insult. Instead, give a blessing. Give a good word. Again, the same phrase here now he used in the previous chapter. He says again, it is for this reason you were called. Literally, it says, because into this you were called. Because into this you were invited. So into what? Don't repay evil for evil. Don't return insult for insult, but instead give a blessing. That's what you were invited to. In case you, that's the very part that everyone wants to throw away, isn't it? People want to follow Yeshua till it comes to that moment. Till it comes to the moment where it's like, okay, but hold on a second. Hold on a second. You want me to just, did you hear what they said about me? Did you hear what they said to me? Did you see the way they treated me? So no, it's at this point that I have to fight back. That's what we want to do. We want to keep Yeshua while he's convenient for us, but in that moment, that's when that's what I least want to do. But it says, that did this very thing. Now, I'm not just telling you to not return insult for insult. But instead, he says the opposite of that, actually. I want you to give a good word. Like, it's one thing to just bite your tongue. It's one thing to just, bite your lip and bite down and suck it up and accept the abuse or receive the abuse. That takes one level of self-control, which is a fruit of the Spirit. But to then, instead, when they give an insult, you give a blessing. To do that instead takes another level of self-control that is supernatural. And it's not intended to be in some sort of nasty, passive-aggressive way. Right? And that's the thing we have to deal with our inner man. To where when they insulted him, when they mocked him, he gave a blessing. He said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That's what came out of him. So what squeezes out of us in that moment? Don't give back what they're giving. What's overflowing from them? Insults and abuse. What should overflow from us? What is in us? Life and blessing. And when what wants to overflow from us is something other, that's recognition, not condemnation, but recognition of how far I am from who I was called to be. Lord, transform me from the inside out so that I want what you want, so that I think like you think, so that I more and more naturally respond how you would respond. When I find myself ready to strike back, it means I'm not dying to my flesh. It means my flesh is ruling me. I'm not holding my fleshly cravings at a distance like he told us to. It's ruling me in that moment. That's why in Galatians it says, so walk by the Spirit and not according to the flesh. Not according to this kind of hostility. The flesh is at war against the Spirit. That's a different passage. But it says you were invited to this so that you might inherit a blessing. You were invited to this, and there's going to be an inheritance of a blessing. It's not the earning of a blessing. It's not something you've earned. It's an inheritance, so that you might inherit a blessing. You might gain. You will inherit. It uses the word for inherit, a blessing. And then he quotes from Psalm 34. It says, "Remember what the Scripture says." Okay, remember, Psalm 34 is an acrostic. Psalm 34 is an acrostic where, every verse starts with a different letter. We've gone through Psalm 34, and it's like you're sitting down with the children. And so when you get to this verse that he's quoting, it's basically, who wants to live a long life? Who wants to see good days? Who wants life? You delight in life. And the kids say, me. Okay, then here's what you do. So this is what's been driven into you. Who wants to see life and length of days and desires life? That's the question, right? So for the one who loves life, wanting to see good days, must keep his tongue from evil. He must stop his glossan, your tongue. That's where we get the word glossary, right? From glossan, from your tongue. So glossary you got to keep your glossary, your vocabulary, your tongue from injury, from committing injury. You want to live a long life? That's what you desire. You desire life. You desire to see good days. Keep your tongue from evil, and keep his lips from speaking falseness or deceit. All right. For the one who desires life, love, and to see good days must stop his tongue from causing injury and his lips from speaking falsely. Verse 11. He must turn away or turn aside, bend away. Like the word it uses is like laying down away. It makes me think of the Matrix, although I don't think they had that in mind where you do Bend away from evil and do good. Let your works be good. He must pursue, or he must seek shalom, investigate it, desire after it. Seek shalom and pursue it. Not just seek to understand it, but then run after it, pursue it. For the eyes of Adonai are on the righteous, and his ears open to their prayers. But the face of Adonai is against those who do evil. And so the picture here, the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and in the language actually his face is also upon in the Greek here. It's his face is upon the evildoers as well. Like he sees you, he's watching. You want to live life. He's watching. He sees you. He hasn't lost track of you in the place where you are. His eyes were on Yeshua, and Yeshua did not return insult for insult and injury for injury, but instead he entrusted to the judge who judges righteously. And that's what we're to do. Not to return insult, but instead to give a blessing. Because the Lord is watching, and he hears your prayers, and he's paying attention to what you're doing. So walk like him. Follow his example. Eyes on the shepherd, right? Not on the shadows. And so that's what we're called to in the midst of a hostile world. To this you were called. It's not a convenient calling. It's not easy. And Peter's reminding them because there's probably temptations there to just go forget it. I'm suffering. What's going on here? He says to keep your eyes fixed. Your suffering is producing something, and when your salvation, he says in chapter 1, will be made known, will be revealed. So you hang on. You hang on until the end, and you continue. And hanging on to the end has to do with not just surviving where you are. You're where you are on purpose, so now you step into it. You step into, in the midst of hostility, to being Yeshua. You go at it with purpose. You know that when you suffer for his name's sake, that you're blessed. He told you this would happen. Don't suffer for doing things the way of this world and then calling it godly. It's when you suffer like he suffered in doing it his way. That's when you're blessed. Let's follow the Yeshua like Yeshua. Let's follow after him. Let's be like him in the midst of a hostile world. Amen? All right. Well, let me say good morning to anybody that I missed. And like I said, I know it's easy to talk about. It's not easy to do. It's really not. Look, in your own family, in your own home. It starts there. It starts there. When they hurl their insults, how do we respond? Well, hold on, with my kids. Well, hold on, but we always, but they did this and they did that. This is the starting point. This is the starting point. When you feel like you're getting unfair treatment, mistreatment, how can you be Yeshua in the midst of where he's placed you, in the midst of a place of hostility? To not just bear down and but to come to a place where you can bless those who curse you, pray for those who persecute you. And that's what we're called. That's what we were invited to. All right. Well, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Shalom, shalom. Have a beautiful day.